Trevor, right?
Well, not so much a geologist, but I
Okay. PGO is
ge
a geomorphologist.
geomorphology. Yeah.
Right. So, yeah, I've never not learned something anytime I spent more than a minute with Trevor. And so he's going to present to us regional curve study that he worked on at Ecoreg and supported by Stantec. And the title of his presentation is "The Answer Is in the River: Regional Curves to Support Stream Restoration Initiatives in Southern Ontario." So exciting stuff, Trevor. If you want to just take it away, that'd be great.
Okay. So the screen is up. Can you see everything okay?
Looks good.
Okay. Yeah. Well, Heather Amaro and we were colleagues back at Stantec back in a different life, and we worked together on this project. And with the support, as I said, of Stantec and Dave Battlesback, who basically taught me how to identify bankful. And once I knew how to identify bankful, then I was off to the races. So one of the things we did was try to put regional curves together for Southern Ontario. And so what's in this talk? So just sort of five things off the top. We're going to do a little background on what is a regional curve, how they're developed, some of the results that we came up with in from our field observations, and then how is a regional curve applied? How can we use it to kind of help us with stream design? And at the end, we'll just, if there's any questions, then we'll have time for those as well. So what is a regional curve? So a regional curve is basically a tool to help dimension a channel, which sounds like something that might be easy to do, but it's not. It's actually pretty challenging. Excuse me, pretty challenging. So, and channels that need restoration are those that we need to figure out how big they need to be, and sometimes that's not easy because they've either been messed around with or they're unstable. There's usually things wrong with them that make it very difficult to identify bankful, which, as I mentioned, is really important and kind of key to getting you started with channel restoration. And there's different ways of estimating channel size. You can do it analytically using models, or you can use an analog approach where you go out and measure, say, a reference reach, which is in good shape, and kind of relate it back to where your project reach is. Or there's an empirical method, which is what we're going to look into today, and looking at regional curves. So essentially, a regional curve is just an equation. It's an equation which can be expressed as an equation itself or as a plot on a graph. And it's used to just estimate the bankful discharge or the bankful cross-sectional area at riffles, and then as expressing that as a function of drainage area. So you can see there you can have an equation or you can plot it as a line on a curve. And the idea is to get as many different channels of different sizes as you can to kind of build up that curve so you get a sense of how big the channel is related to drainage area. So when we were developing the curve for Southern Ontario, um, one of the things we had to know was a little bit about the terrain we were measuring in. So here's a map of Southern Ontario. You can see surrounded by the Great Lakes. We're kind of that peninsula of land that kind of juts down in through Michigan, Pennsylvania, New York, and surrounded by three Great Lakes. And it's a very highly populated area, a lot of large centers there, Toronto, Brampton, Kitchener, Markham. So there's a lot of urban areas here. And as you may know, there's a lot of watercourses in urban areas that are often disturbed and need restoration. So that was one of the key factors um, that led us to choosing this area. Um, we wanted areas that had similar geology, similar precipitation amounts, and that's what those blue lines are on the map. You'll see that is the precipitation isopleths in millimeters. So 900 is about 35 inches a year, 1,000 millimeters is about 40 inches a year. So that gives you an idea of the sort of the rainfall that falls in this part of Southern Ontario. So once we kind of had that worked out, we then decided what size watercourses are we interested in. And the literature led us to another paper that had studied the large watercourses in Southern Ontario, generally about 100 or 200 square kilometer watercourses and higher. So we were looking at smaller drainage areas. We kind of wanted to know, does the regional curve extend down to these really small watersheds? And if so, let's see if that's the case, because oftentimes the water courses that are being restored are these small water courses. They're generally not the big ones. They tend to be smaller creeks flowing in urban areas, oftentimes. So we just didn't want to assume that the existing regional curve for big water courses would extend down to these smaller ones. So we chose creeks that had unregulated natural flows, slopes generally kind of, 0.2 to 1.5%. And of course, we had to be able to get at these sites safely so we could collect our measurements. So once we had that all together, we got out and got busy surveying. So here we were at our field sites. We looked for channels that were sort of in a quasi-equilibrium state. That's just a fancy way of saying stable. Sediment loads coming in roughly equal the sediment loads leaving the watercourse. So they basically had good bankful features that we could rely on that were suitable. We had a look at the geology, made sure that matched what the map said, and that as I mentioned, that our bankful features were reliable. So we collected fairly simple data, actually, just cross sections. We measured like the bankful width and the bankful mean depth, cross sectional areas. We tried to do as many riffles as we could because, one riffle might not be representative. So we wanted to get as many as we could. And then later we would all combine them and just have sort of an average dimension for this particular site. And we measured the slope. And we also, thanks to David, who taught me about inner berms, we measured inner berms, which are essentially, they're like a bankful feature, but they're a lower than bankful feature. They're just sort of a smaller feature that kind of gives the channel definition during low flows. And they're also something that we measured. So the data we collected, we were in 3 different hydrophysiographic regions based on the geology and precipitation. We got to 22 different water courses, 31 different sites in these water courses. So 31 is sort of the magic number. So that's creeks we went to with 31 different drainage areas and a total of 64 cross sections in all of those. And so the dimensions were based sort of on a site average. So we plotted these dimensions against drainage areas and did just a really basic regression analysis using Excel. So here's an example of sort of one measurement at one creek site here. We measured the bankful dimensions here and plotted it up in Rivermorph, which is a software package that can be used to graphically take a look at the data once you get back and enter it. This gives an example of a cross section here. Bankful is sort of at the top edges there. You can see the inner berm feature that's a little lower there. We also measured bankful mean depth, the inner berm area and the water surface slope. And then for this drainage area of just under 5 square kilometers. So that was considered one data point for of one of those 31 stations that we went to. So a lot of things that we looked at these sites. We looked at land use. Basically, was it a rural area or was it an urban system? Bank cover was important. Is it grassed or forested? Because that will have an influence on what the channel is going to look like. The slope of the channel, its hydraulic radius. Manning's N was used to help us with velocities and bankful velocity measured with Manning's equation. So sorry, Manning's N was calculated using Cowan 56, which was a pretty good method. Once we kind of had all that together, we had measurements of bankful width, bankful mean depth, cross-sectional area, and the inner berm cross-sectional area. And those items there that are in yellow, those are the four key measurements that were measured in the field to which regional curves were generated. Okay, so here's what some of the results were here. So one thing that's important is what are some of the possible influences on regional curves? What are some of the things that affect, basically, what are some of the things that affect how big a channel is going to be in a certain part of the world? And one thing is certainly the hydrophysiographic region it's in, the amount of rainfall it gets, what the geology is like. That's an influence. Another influence is the bank vegetation. So it's known that grass channels look very different than wooded channels, or channels that are flowing in wooded areas. And land use might have some impact too. There's been some talk. People say that urban channels are different than rural channels. So we wanted to see is this the case? So we found out that hydrophysiography, at least for the three regions that were studied in this study, did not influence the curve. We plotted them up for each of the regions, and they were essentially the same curve. So that gave us the green light to combine all of the results into one single curve for the area. And this is what the curve looked like. So the different regions, the sites were located in Kitchener-Waterloo, Peel region, which is sort of northwest of Toronto, and then York-Durham, which is north of Toronto. And this is all of the results here, which kind of fit on this curve. And this is drainage area here. We're plotting its drainage area on the x-axis and the bankful cross-sectional area on the y-axis. So essentially, this is what the data is telling us how large the channels are, how drainage area influences the size of the channel in this particular region. So then we started breaking out the data and said, what do the curves tell us about bankful width and depth? So here's the bankful area curve here in red. So this is for bankful area, and then the inner berm is that smaller than bankful feature that was observed at all but two of the sites that we went to. So we had 29 sites that had reasonable inner berms present that were measured. And R squared not quite as high as the R squared for bankful area, but still not too bad. So this is sort of there's definitely something going on there, this feature here. So if the inner berm area was ever used in a stream restoration, it would give you an idea how to size that smaller than bankful feature that gives the channel a little more definition to convey those lower flows. So those are the area curves, bankful cross-sectional area and inner berm area. And then some of the curve influences, I mentioned bank vegetation. So here's an example on the top here. This is Petticoat Creek was in a wooded area. See lots of trees there. And in wooded areas, the bankful width tends to be a lot higher and the mean bankful depth lower. So width to depth ratios higher in areas that are wooded. And then when you get out into a grass watercourse, you have narrower and deeper channels. And the interesting thing is that the bankful areas don't change. They're still correct, and both like the bankful areas are not influenced by vegetation type, just the width and the depth. So yeah, so in wooded areas, a lot of the cross-sectional area is expressed as width, whereas in grassed areas, a lot of the cross-sectional area is expressed as depth. So something important to consider if you're using a regional curve to kind of estimate how wide a channel should be, you need to consider the vegetation type. So here's all four of the bankful curves here. So at the top we have bankful width. So this is the size of the bankful width channel, and this is only for grassed areas. So you I looked at the data, and 24 of the sites that we went to were in grassed uh, areas. They were grassed channels where the bank vegetation consisted of grass. And the other channels that were studied, I think there were like 7, they were in wooded areas. So I had to kind of, when I did the curve for the bankful width, I had to remove the channels that were measured in wooded areas because it would have added a lot more scatter to the data. It doesn't apply. So this is the bankful regional curve for uh, channels in grassed areas. And then at the bottom, this is the bankful mean depth curve, also for grassed areas. So an important consideration. And I didn't plot the curve for the wooded areas because there were only 7 sites. So I just didn't think that was perhaps quite enough to warrant doing that. And other influences, upstream land use. So what effect does the land use have on the size of a channel, how big a channel gets? And in this study, we used um, the literature identified any watershed that was over 25% community or built up was sort of defined as urban. So going through the data, I found that we had 10 stations, 10 sites that were in what satisfied this criterion. So we had 10 urban sites, and the other 21 were rural, and 31 sites in total. So here's what the curves look like for the urban, rural, and the sort of the composite urban, both urban and rural. And you can see the numbers. There's slight differences in the coefficients and the here, but not really not a big difference. So the conclusion was is that at least in Southern Ontario, land use did not play a role in what the regional curve looked like. So a channel will get as big as it's going to get regardless of land use. So once we have all this data and we have a regional curve, how does one apply it? So regional curves, they're just a tool. They're just one tool in the toolbox. And like you can't build a house with one tool, the same goes for regional curves. You can't use them exclusively to tell you how big a channel is going to be, but they're a very useful tool to have as a check. So you can use them to kind of, if you've kind of gone and done your estimates and you have an estimation of how big the channel should be, a regional curve is a really good reality check. That'll help you know if you're in the right ballpark. And if you're not, then that's a good heads up to go back and maybe recheck your numbers and make sure that you can explain why how you came up with the dimensions you came up with. So regional curves kind of represent actual stream dimensions in a region. It's like this is what the streams are telling us how big they get in a particular region. And because of that, they're really good in supporting designers in coming up with that all-important question, how big should this stream be? And they're also good support for regulators who have to look at, these, let's face it, the design briefs that accompany any restoration plan can be really complicated, involve a very subtle interactions between a watercourse and its watershed. And it's something that takes a lot of experience and time and is a challenge to get your head around. So the more help you have doing this, the better. And so it's a support for regulators too. So basically, the thing to take away is that don't use regional curves to tell you how big a watercourse should be, but you can definitely use them to make sure that you're on the right track and your measurements and your dimensions kind of align with reality. So in Southern Ontario, here's some of the takeaways from all of the data that we collected. Some of the limitations, I guess, of the curves here. So the different sites that we measured, that we went out to in the field, we're in a kind of a range of different precipitation amounts. So going from 825 up to 970 millimeters, which again is about 30 to 40 inches of rain per year. So that's kind of that application area. All of the channels that we measured were semi-alluvial till, and that just means that there's alluvium over top of glacial till, which is really prevalent in southern Ontario. None of the channels had any bedrock control, and that was important, which I'll show you in a minute. Creek slopes generally less than 1.5%. Up the land use, we some of the creeks were up to 70% urbanized. So that's so basically from near zero up to 70%, and the curves were generally the same. Creek banks, they were generally grassed. So if you're looking at the width of the mean depth curves, if you're in a wooded area, then don't use this regional curve to estimate bankfill width or depth. But the bankfill area curve still applies regardless of bank vegetation. And the watershed areas we looked at range from about half a square kilometer almost up to 100 square kilometers. So it kind of nicely fitted that lower range that we were looking for. So how did it compare to other regional curves? You can see here the southern Ontario curve is kind of split up into the large water courses, which is the black curve there in dashed lines, and then the small water courses is the solid line. So pretty good alignment there. Just the curve just extends down into those smaller water courses, and you can see that Western New York, the water courses there are almost the same size, and in southeastern Lower Michigan, they're a little bit smaller. And I think that's because they get a lot less rainfall in southeastern Lower Michigan. So that can be explained through differences in rainfall there, which is why it's important to know what the rainfall is in your area and make sure that you're not crossing over any regional boundaries that might affect bankfill size. And just as a footnote here, getting back to why bedrock in a channel is important, is that if there's bedrock in a watercourse, bedrock, as you know, kind of inhibits erosion. The channel will has enough energy to get so big, and then the bedrock seems to just prevent it from getting beyond that. So this was a curve point that was measured in Bronte Creek, which is a bedrock controlled watercourse in southern Ontario. And we know that we measured bankfill area, but this is where the point plotted. And it basically what it means is that the watercourse bankfill dimensions were a lot smaller than what the curve was saying they should be. And the only difference that we saw was that it was a bedrock channel. And so the channel couldn't quite get up to its size, it would appear. So that's important. If you're doing any of these measurements in your area and you suspect there could be bedrock, then you have to kind of make sure that's considered if you're putting these curves together anywhere in your region, and keep an eye out for bedrock, because it does have an effect. And if you're finding a point that doesn't kind of plot on the curve and it's down below it, then chances are you might have bedrock control. So that's just a caveat to bear in mind if you ever go and try to build these curves in your region. So this is the last slide here, and it's just an example of how the regional curve was applied recently in southern Ontario. So the engineer that I work with, Heather, she did some various analysis here to figure out what the bankfill area should be based on these different analyses that were done. And at the end of the day, we chose a bankfill area that was pretty much in line with what the mini regional curve said. I'm afraid I can't explain exactly why that number 1.58 was chosen. What I can tell you though is that the mini regional curve was useful in helping us get there. So, and I think that's that. So thank you very much. Any questions?
Thank you, Trevor. That was a very thorough presentation. I really like that. I enjoyed it. I think everybody did. Yeah, as Trevor mentioned, are there any specific questions, comments on some of those slides? This is a good presentation. Be curious to hear what others think. I always have a comment. Here's Morgan Byers sends in this comment. What was the range of watershed impervious cover of the urban sites? Interesting. And elaborating on his comment, he's seen in Austin, Texas, a notable change in channel size for impacted watersheds above the 20%. Excuse me. And then we have less than 7. You've referenced less than 70%. Maybe the developments are different. That's a good question. Morgan, do you want to elaborate?
Sure. Yeah, this is always an interesting conversation for me because it's not terribly intuitive. I can't see myself. I don't know if y'all can see me, but it's not terribly intuitive that you change the land use conditions, significantly altering the flow regime, but then this bankful channel would remain yet not affected, at least in the parameters that we're describing them by. And I'm just wondering if that's everybody's observing that universally, or maybe the sites, particularly in Ontario, or the other ones that I've seen in the southeast area. Maybe they haven't been, reached that threshold, but it's just an interesting conversation because it's not always terribly intuitive to me that we would take for saying the urban and rural shape or geometry, let me just say, is not impacted by land use. It just makes me say,
Yeah,
because the flow regime is completely different. It's just not intuitive why that would be.
that's a good point, Morgan. So what do you think, Trevor? Why is it consistent between urban and rural? What's your conjecture or speculation on that? Sometimes, as Morgan points out, maybe the more developed areas are more prominently different. What do you think?
Yeah, no, that's true, and certainly early in my career, there were a lot of water courses in urban areas that were obviously different than what they had been earlier. So land use definitely changed what these water courses look like. And so I can't speak for your region, Morgan, but for Southern Ontario, what I seem to observe was that when an area was urbanized, there were, first of all, there were no stormwater controls. This would be back in the 80s when this was happening. And so what would change was the flow regime that would change. So that the time that water got into the channel, that would generally reduce. So water got into the channel faster, and it definitely changed things. And the change that I saw in the channel was that there'd be like a head cut. The channel slope was kind of too high for that change in the flow regime. So this head cut would work through, and the channel would abandon its floodplain. So that kind of gives when a channel kind of cuts down and in sizes, it gives the impression that the channel's getting bigger. But the top of the bank is no longer bankful. The bankful elevation is kind of dropping down with the water surface elevation, but it's such a new channel that Bankful hasn't had time yet to kind of establish a new reliable indicator there. So the geomorphic indicators aren't there yet. So as the channel is transitioning and Bankful drops, it finally reaches a slope that it can work with. But the channel's now incised, so it has to erode. It has to kind of migrate sideways and cut a new floodplain, as you will. And once it starts cutting that new floodplain, then that new bankful feature becomes visible. We can start to see, oh, here's where the here's where the bankful feature is. And then if you were to kind of measure the bankful area before the channel incised, and then once you'd get a certain size, and if you measured the bankful area after the channel had redeveloped a new bankful area, those areas don't seem to be any different. But that's sort of my kind of take on how urban streams have evolved over the years in Southern Ontario. And initially they kind of channels were on their own. They had to fend for themselves. If the flows change, they're like, well, if nobody's going to fix me, I'm going to have to fix myself kind of thing. And that's what channels do. If you change the flow regime, they will adapt and change their slope. That's basically the main thing they do. They change their slope, and changing the slope changes a lot of other things. They have to basically regroup at a lower elevation so they can basically convey those flows without excessive erosion. And as soon as they lack the energy to push all that sediment through, that's when they become stable again. So that's sort of maybe a jumbled account of what I see is going on and doing that. Maybe Dave has some thoughts, or Josh has some thoughts about adding to that. But
well, I think that's a good answer, Trevor. And brief, I think it sounds like, measuring channels that demonstrate stable indicators as opposed to running around and just measuring channels that are in flux, perhaps, in a lot of these urban studies that we see. And maybe perhaps the floodplains in this geography where you are might enable a little more development, as opposed to maybe some of the urban environments that Morgan's referring to, where the floodplains don't enable some readjustment, naturalization. I wanted to get to Robert Stewart's question here, if I might. And he noticed reed canary grass being particularly narrower than wooded streams, and his question was about invasives, and maybe any invasives that you may have incurred, your grass channels in particular. And Robert, feel free to elaborate on your question.
Yeah, just doing some work in Pennsylvania and Ohio, and seeing channels that are choked out with reed canary grass, and they get necked down super narrow as compared to the same stream through wooded areas. But we don't have like a bunch of native grasses, for example, like you would in the Midwest. And so I was wondering if you notice a difference between, say, a native grass versus something like reed canary, which comes in and basically chokes out a channel.
No, I haven't investigated that like particular question. But yeah, invasives are problematic because they kind of exclude all other species, and so just a monoculture. And a problem we have in Southern Ontario, at least in where I live, is it's a broadleaf annual. I can't quite remember what it's called, and it's kind of a double whammy, because it's all green and looks, the bank's completely covered with vegetation, but then it loses its leaves and just disappears. So it's at a time of the year when the channel is at its most vulnerable, when the flows are higher, that controlling influence disappears. So it's a problem, because when it's there in the summer, it restricts anything else from growing, and then it disappears in the winter months when the flows are kind of higher. And so that's another problem, and I can't remember what it's called. It looks like a broadleaf shrub, but it's an annual, and it's invasive.
So I think I don't want to interrupt too much on that. I think that's a good point. But what I'm noticing here, these two nuances, in particular, it draws me to a slide where you presented the application of our regional curves. And I think that's a really important moment, is how we apply these regional curves. We see a lot of times people are often just using them as a design template, and your reference to as a smart check, and being able to understand why we might deviate from that, or why our design might depart from that. I think that's hugely important as our practice becomes more and more commoditized. I think it's really important that we stay focused on the matter of craft, as opposed to just applications. And along that thread also, I really appreciate that you extended the large river study, because many times someone might just extrapolate that line. Hey, great, it did match up, right? It matched the larger study, and that's really important for this ecoregion, for this area. it worked. And it does, and it's, it validates that. But yeah, we often see people extrapolating lines and designing off of extrapolated lines. So I just really appreciate the care that you managed that matter.
Oh yeah, thanks. And yeah, like I said, it's and the issue of bedrock control is just one controlling influence that we found that had an effect and had a bearing, and there could be other ones that we miss. So nature's full of surprises.
Well, are there do we